There has been a lot of mistakes made in Disney's handling of the Star Wars franchise, and there have been many attempts to diagnose the ultimate cause of those mistakes. But if we look at the big picture from a strictly storytelling point of view, there's one mistake that over time has proven to be the fatal mistake, and not just fatal to the sequel trilogy, but possibly to the entire franchise, and that is the mishandling of the character Rey. In this video, we're going to look at how one poorly written main character has led one of the biggest entertainment franchises in the world down a dead end. So let's get into it on the art of storytelling. So I don't think you need to be a seasoned screenwriter to know that any story is only as good as its main character. The protagonist of a story is everything, and we can sit around and talk about world building and production design and cinematography and special effects until the cows come home. But if Luke Skywalker didn't have the fundamentals of a good protagonist, that is, clear motivations, a relatable human flaw, and a capacity for personal change, then even the original Star Wars trilogy would have sucked, because there would have been no journey and therefore no story. One thing I always admired about George Lucas is that he didn't just extend the Star Wars story as new films were added, he expanded it. And there's a big difference. The original Star Wars film worked really well as a standalone story, one that wasn't necessarily slated for a sequel. But when the time came to develop new stories to add to that story, the writers understood that the only way to do that was to deepen its main character. Luke couldn't just go on being an optimistic young rebel for 2 more movies. He needed to grapple with something bigger, hence the complication of his lineage, leading to a genuinely profound moral question and ultimately a satisfying resolution. By the time we get to the throne room scene, the character of Luke Skywalker has come so far, and we as the audience have come along with him. And we can argue about whether Anakin's character was written as well. But even if you don't like those movies, you've got to admit that Anakin goes on a journey. He certainly ends up in a very different place from where he started.
Anakin Skywalker, meet Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Hi.
And of course, in the full view of the entire saga, Anakin's arc is pretty incredible. Now, when Disney made the decision that the Star Wars saga does not end at Episode 6, but in fact continues through 7, 8, and 9, they of course made a hugely consequential business decision that had big short-term financial rewards. But without realizing it, they also bound themselves to certain narrative commitments that I suspect they didn't fully appreciate at the time. Because by announcing to the world that Episode 7 was coming, they were telling us not that a new story was being told, but that an existing story was not yet finished. And that decision had far-reaching consequences that are just now beginning to materialize as Lucasfilm struggles to find a path forward for the franchise's core storyline. You may have seen in the news recently that, to nobody's surprise, there's ongoing turmoil at Lucasfilm. And what's very interesting this time around is that it seems to be centered on the character of Rey. What exactly is her future in this story? Now, it was announced last year that Rey would be the lead in a new Star Wars film directed by Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, and that the film would tell the story of her efforts to rebuild a new Jedi Order. Several writers have since left that project, leaving its future in doubt, and the film was recently removed from Disney's 2026 release schedule, leading many to believe that it has been quietly cancelled. Meanwhile, Disney has announced another new trilogy, and yes, reports are that these will be episodes 10, 11, and 12, and many are speculating that Rey is being positioned as the protagonist of these new films, given that Disney seems to regard her as, quote, their most valuable cinematic asset. I think what they mean is that they're heavily invested in the image of Rey as a cultural icon and as the face of the Skywalker saga. She's the one the general public recognizes as Luke Skywalker's replacement. The problem, of course, is that her character was never really written, and I don't say that to be hyperbolic. A character with no motivations or flaws, who doesn't undergo some kind of significant change, is not a character by any literary definition. I've watched 3 movies about Rey, and I don't feel like I ever went on any kind of journey with her. I remember that when it started, I was very curious about her. She was likable and seemed to have like a mysterious past that I enjoyed speculating about. In fact, it seemed like her whole character motivation was to learn about who she was. And I think we all remember theorizing about whether she was Luke's daughter or perhaps the reincarnation of Anakin. There were some interesting possibilities there. But as we all know, that mystery went nowhere. Somehow she ended up being Palpatine's granddaughter so that she could overcome the dark side at the last minute. I'm sure I don't need to labor on why this represents a total failure of character writing. The thing that I find so fascinating about this massive fumble is that the people responsible for writing Rey's story Obviously, no. What is necessary for a compelling main character? I don't think we can account for it by sheer ignorance of basic writing principles. Instead, the real culprit is the greed and hubris of the Walt Disney Company. Famously, this trilogy went ahead without an approved story treatment or even an outline of Rey's character arc, and the only way that could happen is if the key decision makers at Disney and Lucasfilm sincerely believed that Rey's character was not primarily important, that so long as the films were passable as a Star Wars product, fans would keep coming back and the franchise would go on. And it's only now, a decade later, that they're seeing just how fatal and short-sighted that mistake truly was. With shareholders salivating over the next blockbuster trilogy, the studio needs desperately to expand the franchise when unfortunately all they've done so far is extend it. They're now realizing that by not giving due respect to the writing challenge they inherited when they purchased George Lucas's IP, they stranded themselves in a narrative dead end that is actually impossible to write their way out of. What journey could Rey possibly go on that wouldn't feel totally overdrawn and redundant after the ludicrous excess of Episode 9? What kind of galactic tyranny comes after the Final Order? At this point, what is the Skywalker saga even about? What unifying thread could justify these stories being episodes in the same series? If Rey has already adopted her identity as a Skywalker and has never had to learn or master the Force, what moral question could she possibly pose as the story's ongoing protagonist? William Shakespeare himself could not devise a plot that makes this story make sense, unless, of course, Darth Jar Jar was finally revealed to be a Sith Lord, which would explain a lot. Now, if I had to guess why the Star Wars franchise is struggling most of all to retain writers, I would say that it's because the studio's short-sighted, profit-driven writing decisions have left its most lucrative series narratively bankrupt and unsalvageable even by the industry's most talented writers. And this fatal mistake may go down in entertainment history as proof that genuine storytelling is a franchise's most valuable cinematic asset. But I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you on the next one.